like to share with you a few of the things I do in my online classes. I always begin my online classes with a welcome letter. The letter is always written, but I often include a video attachment as well. This letter helps students get a sense of what will be taking place in the class, who I am, and how they can contact me. Here's an example of my Ed 632 syllabus, Cultural, Social, and Philosophical Issues in Education. I begin with a course description, but I also include what this course description means to me. I try to personalize the content to help students understand that there is a relevance and urgency to learn the material. Naturally, I include course objectives, but I try to incorporate some other objectives, such as to find joy in our work, to increase our capacity to learn, to increase our confidence in our ability to learn, to develop our ability to inquire and wonder, and to recognize our uniqueness as learners, etc. And I also talk a little bit about the importance of questioning and wondering and why this is important for graduate work. Here's an example of Week 1, Part 1 of my Ed 200 Foundations class. Here I begin with an introduction to myself, ask students to introduce themselves, and then invite them to take a journey with me as we explore the ideas of educational foundations. I throw in some, what I think are some great stories and memorable stories to students. I discuss the reason why we would take and study foundations. We try to define education. And I begin to emphasize the importance of understanding. Then we move into the importance of narratives and the fact that narratives are powerful and that they can be dangerous, but they can also be liberating. So we talk a lot about narratives in this class. Here's Ed 200, Week 1, Part 2. I begin with a song. It's Me and Mrs. Jones. And then I weave a story of Bill and Mrs. Jones. Bill is a high school senior. Mrs. Jones is his teacher. And they happen to fall in love. I'm trying to emphasize the idea and the importance of context. And this really becomes evident for students when they find out that Bill is a high school senior citizen. He's completing his GED, and Mrs. Jones is a widow, and she happens to be his teacher. And the story ends that these two end up in a lovely love affair. Throw in a story about Mama Davola's cupcakes to help students understand context and frames. Move into the idea of Aristotle's four causes. We take some familiar and simple examples to show how at least four causes are in play when something comes into being. We touch on phenomenological variations. And then I move into the question of what is it that brings sushi into being. And we contrast this and compare this with what it is to bring a Big Mac into being, or what's required. And we start to see that the context is different, but interestingly, as students find, this context is very much like the context that exists in schooling. Here's an example from an Ed 610 adult learning class. I kind of like this. This is a way that I have students do something practical and new in an attempt to really look at adult learning, because of course they're adults. I have them learn something new, and then we see how the theories of adult learning actually play out in the learning that they're doing. And I try to create a number of themes that they could follow or try. Here's a theme that they can pursue: filmmaking and documentaries, something that some teachers use in school. So as students would learn about filmmaking and documentaries, they start to see how their learning actually plays out in the theories that we're learning in class. Here's an example from my Ed 632 class. In this class, we're starting to look at scientific management and the influence of factories and the industrial age on our development of schools. We look at the evolution of assembly lines. We look at the way that the language and ideas of the assembly line factory model can be extended to living things. We look at curriculum, efficiency, scientific management, the influence of factory on teacher training institutions. To understand some of those fundamental ideas, we look back at photography, the Gilbreths, efficiency, and Frederick Winslow Taylor. This is from an earlier class, Ed 632. In this case, I'm examining context, but I'm drawing in the idea of Deleuze's rhizome theory and the contrast to linear models of development and understanding. Here's an Ed 615 class. In this class, again, we're looking at context, at some specific examples to see how these ideas can inform our understanding of schools. In this class, I happen to look at the experience of mechanical time and show the difference between mechanical time and how we experience it and the experience of duration. Try to incorporate some music examples and some visual examples of how schedules and linear thinking come into play. Here's an example from an Ed 615 summer class. In this part of the class, I'm talking about algorithms, using cooking as an example. But the thing I find interesting in this class is the idea of the referential whole, which I also refer to as the equipmental nexus. I try to give students an idea of how context confers meaning. And in this case, I use an example of an object they wouldn't typically understand and then provide enough context so they can see what one has to know or connect to make a certain object, an unfamiliar object, understandable. I also give an example of photocopiers, or the way we copied in the past. Here we look at how photocopiers come into being within a context, but interestingly we can see that the photocopier will have an influence again on the context, so there's a reciprocity here. Finally, here's an example from a 632 class. We're talking about the body, neuronal cell assemblies. I give some personal examples. Give lots of examples that students would feel. Some stories about my experiences with the cinnamon bun. We look at learning, grasping neurons so students can feel what it feels like to see something. And we get into the theories a little bit. And we question and we consider just how complex the entire body is and how important the entire body is in learning anything. And how technologies and two-dimensional screens can limit our ability to fully understand anything. Here I'll end with a story a story when I took a stagecoach here across the Oregon Trail. Well, not really.